Hello, everyone. Uh, Today we're continuing our study of the Communist Manifesto. This is we have come so far, and the only true part of the Communist Manifesto, as it is left. It's part 4, chapter 4, position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. It's a relatively small chapter. Well, actually, it is a absolutely small chapter. It's only 1 page long. So, of course, this will be not enough for the whole stream. So, after that, we are going to see a little bit of pre-notes and after notes. And I'll share some of my thoughts about the whole thing. Uh, so, without any further ado, let's jump into it. So, position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. Section 2 has made clear the relations of the communists to the existing working class parties, such as the Chartists in England and the agrarian reformers in America. The communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class. But in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement. In France, the communists ally with the Social Democrats against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, reserving, however, the right to take up a critical position in regard to phases and illusions traditionally handed down from the Great Revolution. In Switzerland, they support the radicals without losing sight of the fact that this party consists of antagonistic elements, partly of democratic socialists, in the French sense, partly of radical bourgeois. In Poland, they support the party that insists on agrarian revolution as the prime condition for national emancipation. That party, which fomented the insurrection of Krakow in 1946. In Germany, they fight with the bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way against the absolute monarchy, the feudal squirearchy, and the petty bourgeoisie. But they never cease, for a single instant, to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat, in order that the German workers may straightway use, as so many weapons against the bourgeoisie, the social and political conditions that the bourgeoisie must necessarily introduce along with its supremacy, and in order that, after the fall of reactionary classes in Germany, the fight against the bourgeoisie itself may immediately begin. The communists turned their attention chiefly to Germany because that country is on the eve of the bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization, and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th and France in the 18th century, and because the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the front as the leading question in each the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. Finally, they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. Mhm. A very short chapter, uh, rather a conclusion that goes over some parties in countries. Actually, I thought that would be more like how communists, as described here in the manifesto, would interact with present parties in an abstract country, right? But as the Communist Manifesto actually attacks its not rivals, not colleagues, but well, I'll just call them colleagues, if I may. They attacked a branch of socialism, the German socialism, that they do not have any realistic description of the world and concrete goals, aims, and they are more likely to operate with abstract ideas, which authors think is counterproductive, right? But obviously, since they are in favor of realistic, pragmatic approach, they do not wonder about some abstract parties in abstract countries and exactly proclaim things as they are, for which they have my respect. Yes. They put a great emphasis on Germany in the last chapter. And again, I'm going to acknowledge their achievements in the field of literature, because those phrases are just extremely great. Those calls to actions are they are mesmerizing. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. I've heard parts of it, not in this direct order. More likely, I heard it taken out of the context. But now, as I read it as the closing statements in the Communist Manifesto, those actually have I have great respect for that phrasing. They have the authors, Marx and Engels. They definitely have some gifts to write literature. Maybe propagandistic literature, but nevertheless, they know how to word things strongly. That's for sure. Again, I actually would add this phrase to a list of very powerful phrases here that I was impressed a couple of streams ago when I was absolutely mesmerized as well by the phrase, which I'm going to not quote but directly read here. One more second, please. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. This is just I love this phrase so much. I love it so much. But coming back to the end of the Communist Manifesto, the official part of it, well, I'm glad that we studied through this document. This is a very interesting document. Right now, I am prone to firstly go through some prefaces and some afterthoughts. Well, not actually afterthoughts, but rather afternotes. They have interesting material in there. I don't think we should focus too much on that because the core of the document is exactly in those 4 chapters. So these I would consider them as some bonus material. So I'm going to go through. If we see the table of contents here, there is editorial introduction, which is laying down the historical context which surrounded the conceivement of this Communist Manifesto. I'm hesitant to read through all the prefaces here because they have some historical some value of historical importance, and it's interesting in historical sense, but I more interested in the logic behind the Communist Manifesto, and those prefaces. Well, of course, they are included here, so they have great value. I'm not sure. I'm not. I do not doubt that. But I'm going to skip them for now. And also, we have letters from Engels to Marx and draft of Communist Confession of Faith. This is actually a draft to. It's a draft to a draft, right? A draft to Communist Confession of Faith, which is the draft to the Communist Manifesto, right? So we're going to hop through this quickly if we will still have time for that. Now, editorial introduction. The Manifesto of the Communist Party was written by Marx and Engels as a Communist League's program on the instruction of its Second Congress, London, November 29 to December 8, 1947, which signified a victory for the followers of a new proletarian line during the discussion of the program questions. When Congress was still in preparation, Marx and Engels arrived at the conclusion that the final program document should be in the form of a party manifesto. See Engels' letter to Marx of November 23rd to 24th, 1947. A catechism form usual for the secret societies of the time and retained in the draft of the Communist Confession of Faith and Principles of Communism, was not suitable for a full and substantial exposition of the new revolutionary world outlook, for a comprehensive formulation of the proletarian movement's aims and tasks. See also Demands of the Communist Party in Germany, issued by Marx soon after publication of the Manifesto, which addressed the immediate demands of the movement. Marx and Engels began working together on the manifesto while they were still in London immediately after the Congress, and continued until about December 13th, when Marx returned to Brussels. They resumed their work 4 days later, December 17th, when Engels arrived there. After Engels' departure for Paris at the end of December and up to his return on January 31, Marx worked on the manifesto alone. Harried by the central authority of the Communist League, which provided him with certain documents, examples given: addresses of the People's Chamber, Hall of the League, of the Just of November 1946 and February 47, and apparently documents of the First Congress of the Communist League pertaining to the discussion of the party program. Marx worked intensively on the manifesto through almost the whole of January 1948. At the end of January, the manuscript was sent on to London to be printed in the German Workers' Education Society's print shop owned by German emigrant J.E. Burkhardt, a member of the Communist League. The manuscript of the manifesto has not survived. The only extant materials written in Marx's hand are a draft plan for Section 3, showing his effort to provide the structure of the manifesto, and a page of a rough copy. The manifesto came off the press at the end of February 1848. On February 29th, once in 4 years, the Educational Society decided to cover all the printing expenses. The first edition of the manifesto was a 23-page pamphlet in a dark green cover. In April-May of 1848, another edition was put out. The text took up 30 pages. Some misprints of the first edition were corrected, and the punctuation improved. Subsequently, this text was used by Marx and Engels as a basis for later authorized editions. Between March and July of 1848, a manifesto was printed in the Deutsche Londoner Zeitung, a democratic newspaper of the German emigrants. Already that same year, numerous efforts were made to publish the manifesto in other European languages. A Danish, a Polish in Paris, and a Swedish under a different title, The Voice of Communism Declaration for the Communist Party, editions appeared in 1848. The translations into French, Italian, and Spanish might at the time remained unpublished. In April of 1848, Engels, then in Barman, was translating the manifesto into English, but he managed to translate only half of it, and the first English translation, made by Helen Macfarlane, was not published until 2 years later, between June and November of 1850, into the Chartist journal The Red Republican. Its editor, Julian Harney, named the authors for the first time in the introduction to this publication. All earlier and many subsequent editions of the manifesto were anonymous. The growing emancipation struggle of the proletariat in the 60s and 70s of the 19th century led to new editions of the manifesto. The year 1872 saw a new German edition with minor correction and a preface by Marx and Engels, where they drew some conclusions from the experience of the Paris Commune of 1871. This and subsequent German editions of 1883 and 1890 were titled the Communist Manifesto. In 1872, the manifesto was first published in America in Woodhull and Claffing's Weekly. The first edition of the manifesto, the first Russian edition of the manifesto, translated by Mikhail Bakunin, with some distortions, appeared in Geneva in 1869. The faults of this edition were removed in the 1882 edition, translation by Georgy Plekhanov, for which Marx and Engels, who attributed great significance to the dissemination of Marxism in Russia, had written a special preface. After Marx's death, the manifesto ran into several editions. Engels read through them all, wrote prefaces for the 1883, what's with my numbers, German edition, and for the 1888 English edition in Samuel Moore's translation, which he also edited and supplied with notes. This edition served as basis for many subsequent editions of the manifesto in English in Britain, United States, and the USSR. In 1890, Engels prepared a further German edition, wrote a new preface to it, and added a number of notes. In 1885, the newspaper Le Socialiste published the French translation of the manifesto made by Marx's daughter Laura Lafargue and read by Engels. He also wrote prefaces to the 1982 Polish and 1983 Italian editions. This edition includes the two earlier versions of manifesto, namely the draft Communist Confession of Faith and the Principles of Communism, both authored by Engels, as well as a letter from Engels to Marx, which poses the idea of publishing a manifesto rather than a catechism. The manifesto addressed itself to a mass movement with historical significance, not a political sect. On the other hand, the demands of the Communist Party in Germany is included to place the publication of the manifesto in the context of the mass movements in Germany at the time, whose immediate demands are reflected by Marx in this pamphlet. Clearly, the aims of the manifesto were more far-reaching the movement in Germany at the time, and unlike the demands, was intended to outlive the immediate conditions. The third address to the International Working Men Association is included because in this speech Marx examines the movement of the working class manifested in the Paris Commune, and his observation here marked the only revision to his social and historical vision made during his lifetime as a result of the development of the working class movement itself, clarifying some points and making others more concrete. Okay, so this was a hell of an introduction. A lot of concrete historical details. I actually, I almost forgot that the English translation that I read through in those streams of mine, they are translations from German, obviously, because we know that Marx and Engels are German. So I am not entirely sure whether these compliments of great literacy, of great achievements in the field of literature that are done in the Communist Manifesto, are they should I address them exclusively to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, or should I also add the immediate translators here to the list of the beneficiaries, right? I wonder who is the translator. Okay, Samuel Moore in 1988, in cooperation with Friedrich Engels. Okay, that's great. Huh. And the source is taken from Moscow. So, well, obviously, this manifesto of the Communist Party has traveled all around the world. So, no wonder here. So, I'm betting that at least Engels helped or directed in some way Samuel Moore in the translations to English. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure that the initial edition that is written in German, obviously, has exactly those qualities that I praised here in terms of literature, of course. So, also, this went through a number of countries again, and what was the situation there, and how it was sort of how it traveled to those countries and translated. So I'm probably going to just jump to the letter from from Engels to Marx, just to see what it is all about, because it is even in introduction said that this is an important thing, right? And we're going to do just that. Okay, so Paris, 23rd to 24th November of 1847. Dear Marx, not until this evening was it decided that I should be coming. Saturday evening, then in Ostend Hotel de la Caron, just opposite the railway station beside the harbor, and Sunday morning across the water. If you take the train that leaves between 4 and 5, you'll arrive at about the same time as I do, Tuesday evening. Give a little thought to the confession of faith. I think we should do best to abandon the catechetical form and call the thing Communist Manifesto, since a certain amount of history has to be narrated in it. Obviously, the form hitherto adopted is quite unsuitable. I shall be bringing with me the one form from here, which I did, Principles of Communism. It is in simple narrative form, but wretchedly worded in a tearing hurry. I start off by asking, what is communism? And then straight on to the proletariat, the history of its origins, how it differs from earlier workers, development of the antithesis between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, crisis, conclusions, in between all kinds of secondary matter, and finally the Communist Party policy, insofar as it should be made public. The one here has not yet been submitted in its entirety for the endorsement, but save for a few quite minor points, I think I can get through it in such a form that at least there is nothing in it which conflicts with our views. Okay, so this is like historical proof of how the Communist Manifesto came to be as a as from the confession of faith of the communist faith. Yeah, draft of the Communist Confession of Faith, right? That was a draft to that, right? Okay, so we also have lots of content here. Draft of a Communist Confession of Faith, the principles of the communism, demands of the Communist Party in Germany, the Paris Commune, address to the International Working Men Association, which is mentioned briefly in editorial introduction. But I'd rather just talk about the manifesto of the Communist Party itself. You see, as I'm in my stream, in my studying of the Communist Manifesto, I'm going to make a claim that it obviously I have no political affiliation with Communist Party, and this study is purely out of the interest. And there are some things that I agree with, some things that I disagree with. But I rather would talk about the logic in this manifesto of the Communist Party. I am absolutely fascinated on how they made a jump in their logic as they identified an enemy, and the enemy is obviously bourgeoisie here. And after that, they are asking themselves, what is the main source of power of our enemy, right? And as far as I can see, they identified it as the capital of bourgeoisie. They even make, I'm sorry, much better. They even make some comparisons with bourgeoisie or small bourgeoisie types, which were on the side of bourgeoisie more or less in terms of their relation with working people and how they describe it in relation to the class exploitation. The small workshop keepers or market traders, right, that later are going to drift rather towards the working class, but they are going to drift to it precisely because of the capital, and more specifically, the insignificance of their own capital in comparison to the bourgeoisie's capital. So the working class has little to more or less zero capital, little to nothing of capital. Those people that we would call more or less aspiring bourgeoisie, but actually the best example is the keepers of the workshop and whatnot. They have some capital, but in comparison with the bourgeoisie, it's exactly insignificant, and only the big capital that the bourgeoisie can hold is enough for them to basically rule the world in such a way that they do. And so I'm absolutely sure that authors here, well, I'm inclined to think that authors of the Communist Manifesto also identified the capital itself that the bourgeoisie hold is the core of their power. So when you have an enemy, you obviously want to displace it from the position of power, right? And one way to do that is through brute force, obviously. The other way is to be smarter about it and attack the strengths of your enemy. And in that case, it would be capital. But they actually went further than that, maybe because they thought that capital, obviously somebody would have to hold the capital. And just as they did with comparison to reactionary socialistic movements, when, for example, I don't actually remember, maybe it was feudalistic socialists. Yeah, feudal socialism. Yes, that's right. I would better look at here. That they thought that feudal socialism is basically trying to restore the world to the previous mode of being, previous mode of production and exploitation, which were in a way more merciful than the current industrial type of exploitation. But still, it is not perfect itself, and even more so, it is destined to came back to the exact same problems that they had at the hands at the time. So the feudal system is bound to produce at some point a bourgeoisie. And so this is the point of why they consider that it's not enough to just go after the bourgeoisie. It's not enough to go after the capital, because capital, when it changes hands, even though the people who are going to hold the capital, they might be of different nature and deeply concerned with the values of the movement that authors of the Communist Manifesto are from, right? Uh, but I think it's inevitable that when the capital is going to, well, the source of power, when it changes hands, it immediately going in the sense of in the understanding of the authors, as I think, the power of the capital is going to corrupt at some point the one who holds it, right? It sounds kind of like even maybe biblical, right? But yes, and it is not enough to just attack the core strength of your enemy. They are about to attack the core of the core, right? So they are going 2 levels deeper, right? And in the core of the capital is the exactly the private property, right? Uh, this is it's not even that it's they are deeply strategic about it, right? So they not only attack the core of the enemy, but are also the core of the core. So they like seeing right through, but also um, they do it in meaning like in terms of the thinking process in extremely revolutionary way, right? Because well, obviously the whole history of humanity was more or less based on the understanding of the idea of private property. Uh, this is at some point become the reason for why people would work or care about working, right? Of course, for the most part of the humanity, the main the main reason to spend money was for the majority of the populace is to spend money on the food, right? So it's not necessarily about private property, but now and then some people were able to do so, and as wise people say, people it's a more or less modern phrase that was popularized by Jordan Peterson, I suppose, that people vote for with their dreams, not their current state, right? So when people are thinking about private property, they're not necessarily thinking about that they do not have much of it. They thinking about the that they could earn it in some way, right? And uh, this was the main mode of being, right? And the idea to just abolish the private property it is such radical thought, and it's looking right at the core of the issue that authors formulated. Again, I'm telling that I do not condone the abolishment of the private property. Sorry, I'm gonna make sure that I said the right thing. Yeah. Okay. I do not condone uh, the abolishment of the private property. I am absolutely not sure, 100%, not even like 50% sure, that this will solve the problems that were presented without creating enormous amount of new problems. But I absolutely admire their thinking. It is extremely revolutionary thought. This I'm absolutely fascinated by it. I can spend a lot of time thinking about it because this is a very radical, very revolutionary way of thinking. I'm going to make a video about that in some time in the future, where I discuss it more uh, in more details, I think, and probably not on the fly as I do now, as I'm thinking about what I'm talking about, right? Uh, on the fly, but rather I'm going to sort it through. But as a guy who works with logic all the time, I'm fascinated by the ease with what the authors of the Communist Manifesto work the uh, with such logical leaps. I'm even I even want to try to adopt this mode of thinking, not in terms of the communistic tendencies, but rather to try, maybe even for some jokes, for the sake of the joke, to try and adopt the same thinking process to some other worldly problems, right? So we have a problem, we identify very conveniently for us an enemy that is outside of our group, not it's not we that are enemy, it's not our bad side that is the issue here. It's them, somebody there, right? And we identify their strengths, and we attack the strengths of our enemies at its core, right? Well, for example, just for the sake of this example, right? I can't help but think about again uh, the talks that Jordan Peterson gave in his like many podcasts. Is that he identified? Well, it's not like he identified them as enemy, but a listener might, if he doesn't really adopted the way that Jordan Peterson thinks about things. Uh, for example, identify an enemy in the intellectual, like academical sphere, right? So he talks about something, for example, that there are uh, professors that are left-leaning, for example, right? And they can outtalk and somewhat outsmart most of their opponents during the debates, right? Possible debates, because they do work on what? Work on training their ability to think on the fly, to really present their ideas, right? And uh, so the strength of those academics is what their intellectual abilities. Mm, not concrete enough. It's very specific. We need very specific formulation. Well, one way of thinking, right? Okay, so they win in public discussions, right? So the issue is their speechcraft, right? And so attack on that, direct attack, would be do not have debates with intellectuals, uh, like live debates, right? Verbal live debates. But more revolutionary way of thinking about solving this problem is to identify the core value behind these verbal abilities of such people and try to attack this verbal ability itself. So this is when this is where the things might get a little bit over the top comical here, but I do not try to mock nobody here, not authors of the Communist Manifesto, not the believers in the Communist Manifesto, no nothing. I'm just purely speculating on how this logic would work. Uh, so one way of thinking about that is to forbid, abolish, in some sense, the verbal communications altogether, right? So the verbal conversations, verbal communication is now forbidden and can only take place when specifically selected committee would announce some things, maybe purely uh, informational, not debatorial facts. For example, what time is it? and what they say, something like that, descriptive, absolutely descriptive, as plain as it can be. And the teachings that, well, not actually teachings, because Communist Manifesto do not forbid, at least in this text, it's not, it does not forbid uh, thinking about capital, right? So I can't really say that it forbid it would be logical for our hypothetical example to forbid the study of verbal speechcraft. Well, it's tautology of a speechcraft, I mean, right? But something like that, right? So I was thinking about this example on the fly. So again, it's not very sharp and clean and beautiful as it would, yeah, as it could be. But again, we have what we have, right? So yeah, this idea is not a very simple one, because you have to, and not everything that would come to mind if you apply this logic uh, would actually make sense. So either my dissection of this logical leaps were not full, maybe I'm missing something. Let me know if that's the case. Well, obviously that's the case, but I am not really sure that what is the problem at the moment. So let me know if you find the answer to that. But also, it might be the case that even though the logic will remain more or less the same as I described here, it cannot be applied to each and every problem that we might have in our lives, right? And obviously so, because if you have an idea that can handle every problem in the world, you might think that you have the universal tool and you're the happiest man alive, but probably this tool is also extremely inaccurate, and in most cases, this tool is going to produce a lot more trouble than it would solve. So I would beware of the ideas that can explain and solve everything that is going on. So yes, obviously you cannot use one idea to explain everything. So this notion of this revolutionary logic is more like a uh, intellectual flex of silly sort. But whatever, not whatever. Rather, we are going to work on that, and I'm going to describe it in greater complexity if I would manage to do so. But at least this is my intention at the moment. So, in the conclusion, I would also spend a little bit more time to again praise the qualities of this document in terms of its literary achievements. I think it is very compelling read. It uses from time to time the language that is absolutely motivating to join some great cause, obviously. Some phrases are absolutely stunningly beautiful, and I would just, regardless of your political affiliations, I would just at least I would took something from that. I'm definitely going to and recommend to everyone, because this is like, this is great stuff. This has some great stuff in it, right? So uh, I don't, I'm not really sure what should I say about the core of the document itself, the political idea that it has. because obviously this is the manifesto is a political document, and this document is used many times for actual political movements, parties, revolutions, obviously. This is which is serious stuff. Wars happened uh, because of that, endless conflicts and whatnot. And I absolutely did not address this idea, uh, and probably I'm not going to, because again, I don't really think that the abolition of the private property, if I understand correctly, this is the core idea here, is exactly what we need, because it seems like a very drastic change. And as to other points that I hear, that presented here, some of them I think is not applicable anymore because they are already in place, have a progressive or graduated income tax, uh, free education for all children in public school, and abolition of factory labor of the children. That is absolutely in place, right? Well, I'm not sure about the universal free education, but in many countries it is in place, which is very good. Uh, some of them, as I said already, abolition of the right of inheritance, for example. This obviously has something to do with the uh, abolition of the private property per se, but I don't feel that this is exactly right, right? So at some point, people, well, I don't think we're even going to have to go through the details why it's not exactly a great idea, right? Uh, so these are my brief thoughts about that. Again, maybe I do not understand something in fully here, so do not jump to conclusions and claim me to be someone I'm actually not, from any point of view. So for everybody who's watching and listening, thank you for your time. I'm going to make a conclusion video sometime soon, and I guess we'll see you then. So have a nice day, and bye bye.